Preface to the paperback edition. I sent the final edited draft of Revolution in the Air to Verso just after Labor Day 2001. The next week came the terrorist carnage of 9/11. By the time the book came off the press, George Bush's open-ended war on terror was in full swing and Iraq was squarely in Washington's gun sights. Before long, the Vietnam War and its lessons again stood at the pivot of nationwide debate. Discussion of whether the U.S. had an empire, and if so, whether that was good or bad, once more entered the mainstream. Racist demonization of the enemy, Arabs and Muslims this time around, returned in full force. The economic, political, and technological terrain had changed in dramatic ways since the 1960s and 1970s. But the experience of the 60s anti-war and anti-racist movements and the radical tendencies that surged out of them suddenly seemed much closer and more relevant than they did during the 1990s, when Revolution in the Air was being written and conservative pundits were proclaiming the end of history. The intensity of post-9/11 conflict is likely the main reason this history of a once dynamic but now all but disappeared political current attracted wider interest than I initially anticipated. I am grateful for the thoughtful reviews that appeared in the Los Angeles Times, the Village Voice, and periodicals across the spectrum of the U.S. left. All reviews are available at revolutionintheater.org. I have learned a great deal from the outpouring of comment and criticism from both veterans of the 1960s and new generation radicals at forums around the country. Reviewers and activists' evaluations of Revolution in the Air's interpretation of this complex history and of the political balance sheet I offer in the book's final chapter have varied from enthusiastic to scathingly critical, but it is heartening to be able to note that the factual accuracy of the narrative, the book's reliability in providing basic information about the organizations and tendencies that are its main subject, has been all but universally acknowledged. Revolution in the Air was written largely to fill in a blank spot in the literature on U.S. radicalism by providing a roadmap of post-1960s Third World Marxism and the new communist movement, to the extent that it has contributed to recovering this rich experience and getting it back into the historical and political mix. The book has already met its prime objective. Since the book's publication, additional scholarship and debate have expanded and modified at least my own understanding of this radical experience and its implications. Hopefully that process will continue. I especially look forward to works that delve into specific organizing campaigns and the day-to-day lived experience of the movement's cadre. Inadequately addressing these vital matters is, in my opinion, Revolution in the Air's single biggest weakness. Understandings also change as the world changes. New conditions push certain factors to the fore and others to the background. Today, the urgencies of a world where Washington proclaims the unilateral right to launch preventive wars and imprison anyone declared an enemy combatant casts 1960s-1970s polarizations into sharp relief. Partly because of this, and partly as the fruit of the last few years' broad-based discussions, I believe it is possible to see more clearly than 4 years ago what is essential in the history and legacy of the new communist movement: passion for justice. But history cannot be forced, viewed as tragedy, as the tale of a protagonist displaying tremendous self-sacrifice and dedication but corroded by narrow-minded self-righteousness. This history's inspiring acts come at the beginning. Only a deep passion for justice propelled so many young radicals to choose the anything but glamorous road of day-to-day organizing in factories, offices, and impoverished communities as the heady 1960s drew to a close. Though a measure of revolutionary romanticism was involved for some, most of those who turned to Lenin, Mao, and Che probed and studied before making this life-changing decision. They concluded that Third World Marxism embodied the most penetrating insights into the workings of U.S. society, that U.S.-style racism, capitalism, and empire-building were structurally and historically intertwined, that the wretched of the earth, people of color at home and abroad, would have to be at the center if the world was to be transformed. The new communist movement was their attempt, decisively shaped by the dominant perspectives in the international left at the time, to turn these insights into a practical political force, to join together as comrades across barriers of race, nationality, gender, and age, to sink roots among workers and the oppressed. It is not mere nostalgia or naivete to admire the audacity of people mostly in their 20s throwing themselves into such a project. But even the most tenacious dare to struggle dedication cannot by itself change the world. Historical circumstances, economic conditions, social structure shaped over decades, the consciousness of millions, constrain what is possible at any given moment. Coming of age in the utopian climate of the 1960s, embracing a Marxism-Leninism billed as an all but omniscient science, these young militants thought they could fast-forward history through hard work and adherence to correct ideas. When U.S. politics began to move rightward rather than leftward in the 1970s, trying to accomplish such a feat proved far more difficult than anticipated, but the young movement's fealty to doctrines rooted in vastly different historical experiences pushed it toward ideological purification rather than strategies more appropriate to changing circumstances. Over time, at different paces and to different degrees in the movement's various constituent groups, valuable insights into U.S. society froze into ritualistic formulas. A culture of dedicated self-sacrifice deteriorated into one of ideological conformity, obedience to increasingly top-down leadership, and sectarian practices. Soon a radical current that had been born out of huge popular movements, and which had drawn its initial dynamism from rich interaction with those movements, lost its connection to the popular sectors capable of driving forward progressive change. The new communist movement's lifespan was relatively short, but its rise and fall trajectory resembles other once promising radical currents. The U.S. is in many respects a deeply conservative country, with a long-entrenched ruling elite and barriers to working-class unity and power that have given radicals heart itches and headaches for generations. Bluntly put, at most times there is a huge gap between the extent of change needed to forge a just society that is not bullying others around the world versus anything resembling the actual political capacity to make that change. The gap narrowed in the 1960s as the black community surged toward equality, millions turned against the war in Vietnam, and movements among Latinos, Asian Americans, Native Americans, women, and lesbians and gays began to flex some muscle. The participation of millions yielded significant victories and raised the prospect of more far-reaching social transformations. This propelled young people in large numbers toward the revolutionary project and inspired them to pour their utmost energy into it. In the 1990s, that gap again widened to a seeming chasm against the backdrop of the right-wing Reagan Revolution, the collapse of the USSR, and a barrage of capitalist triumphalism. In 1999, the large and vibrant NEWTO protest in Seattle amid rising popular anxieties about globalization promised a new cycle of mass resistance. But the 9/11 attacks gave George Bush tremendous political initiative, which he and his far-right allies exploited to justify a program of permanent military aggression and reaction across the board. In the last year, things have begun to change. After Cindy Sheehan camped out in Crawford, Texas, Katrina turned a spotlight on race and class inequities. The majority became disillusioned with the Iraq War, and millions took to the streets to demand immigrant rights. It is a fluid moment. We have not yet seen sustained mass action, much less a large-scale turn to the left, but an increased level of protest and noticeable shifts in the thinking of millions provide openings for radical initiatives that did not seem on the horizon even 2 years ago. At times like this, squeezing previous experiences for everything they can possibly teach is of special value. The scale of the 1960s upsurge politics is millions. As my own thinking has evolved, the paramount matter to which I keep returning is the sheer scale and scope of the 1960s upsurge. This book's first chapter tries to describe that society-shaking tumult, but immersing myself in the post-9/11 resistance to Bush's successor with the terrorist onslaught has driven home the significance of scale and scope more vividly than ever before. There is a big reality check here, a reminder that what masses of people are doing, or not doing, must be the central reference point for effective strategy and tactics. What stands out about the 1960s in this light is the number and diversity of everyday people who embraced political action, sparked by the civil rights movement beginning in 1955. For nearly 2 decades, one new constituency after another entered the fray. Initial stirrings grew into sustained popular motion, and in the late 1960s, mass radicalization. The protest movements were millions strong, combined with dynamic liberation movements then surging across the globe. They seized the moral as well as the political high ground. Movement tactics ranged from militant direct action to the most mild-mannered pleas to Congress. Participants' outlooks stretched from maximalist revolutionism to narrow recipes for reform. Anchored in a black freedom movement expressing the aspirations of the most dispossessed, the emancipatory visions of the 1960s captured the imagination of people from all backgrounds. This upheaval from below was able to force and take advantage of major divisions both within the country's elite and within the more backward sectors of the population. Nothing less would have been able to deliver the setbacks to segregation, racism, the war in Vietnam, and other injustices that the 1960s movements accomplished. Putting this front and center forces us to measure all ideological schemas against a mass action template. If, when, and how masses swing into motion is generally not something under radicals' control, but in every period it is the activity and consciousness of popular constituencies that must shape radical efforts. Many of us once thought that becoming a revolutionary meant seeing the world through the filter of passages from Lenin, but in our zeal to adopt a revolutionary identity we overlooked one of the things Lenin wrote that actually has a universal meaning, something not particularly Leninist at all but common to effective radical leaders of all persuasions. Politics begin where millions of men and women are, where there are not thousands but millions. Radicals must strain every nerve to gain and keep a connection to these millions. We need a connection in life, sustained over time, through durable organizations and institutions, not merely in theory or in self-conception or during brief moments of high-tide protest. This places a premium on resisting all sectarianism and flexibly adapting to new and often unexpected conditions. To be sure, it is not always possible to maintain both left-wing politics and deep connections to millions. In a society where dominant class hegemony is so great, there are times when radicals will be isolated no matter what we do. That was the case during the McCarthy period, and for several years, hopefully about to end, after 9/11. During such times, our side is compelled to seek whatever small openings we can as we defend our principles and tough it out. But recognizing limits on the scope of our immediate practice must not harden into accepting marginal status as a permanent fact of life, much less a mindset that glorifies marginality as a sign of true revolutionary faith. Radicals are defeated before we start if we surrender the idea that it is both necessary and possible to play a vital role in movements of millions. Planting the banners and waiting in a left-wing stronghold for people to come to us will not cut it. Looking for every possible opening to connect with large numbers, especially in communities of color and the working class, and taking into account what key constituencies are already thinking and doing is a far better path. Growing from weak to strong requires willingness to patiently participate in alliances and popular organizations where the leadership is held by non-leftists. Constructing a left that can provide assistance and direction to popular movements while expanding the horizon of what is now considered realistic is a daunting task. Such a left can only take shape in tandem with the growth of broad peace and justice alignments, not in opposition to them. Unpleasant as it may be, this means a serious engagement with the stacked deck of U.S. electoral politics must be one dimension of radical strategy. Other than in exceptional times, elections are the prime way that millions participate in political life. Outside of near-revolutionary situations, grassroots-based movements inevitably seek to meet their goals by pressuring officeholders or electing their own. Reform of the two-party, winner-take-all system, with special emphasis on changing the myriad laws and practices that disenfranchise people of color, are crucial matters for left attention. So is building a peace and justice electoral power bloc along the way. Since the 2000 election especially, veterans of all post-1960s radical tendencies as well as younger activists have been grappling with this issue with growing tenacity and professionalism. I think there remain many important lessons for this kind of effort from the new communist movement's work in the Rainbow Coalition of the 1980s. See Chapter 13. Flexibility, openness, generosity of spirit, and a democratic culture of respect for every individual are indispensable. One of the most counterproductive and painful features of the new communist movement was its tendency to mistake toughness for commitment, rigidity for steadfastness, attacks on other leftists for adherence to principle. To construct a welcoming and sustaining political culture rooted in the U.S. experience, it would be wise to look beyond the Marxist pantheon and learn all we can from the towering intellectual, moral, and political contributions of Dr. Martin Luther King. The new communist movement, along with other aspiring revolutionaries of the 1960s and 1970s, lost its bearings in these areas, but if that were the whole story, studying it today would be mere antiquarians. As I have tried to draw out in this book's final chapter, there were also positive elements in the movement's outlook and practice, insistence on the centrality of anti-racism and internationalism, nurturing organizers who work for a living and engage in politics as volunteers rather than see a union or nonprofit staff job as the ideal. Such qualities remain vital for building a relevant left today. Indeed, changes in both demography and political economy mean that the role of communities of color in galvanizing the broadest possible alliance for justice and peace must be at least as central as in the 1960s. We cannot afford complacency in theory any more than remaining within a comfortable activist bubble in practice. It will take fresh thinking to cope with a world where reactionary theocratic movements of many kinds hold tremendous initiative, where a world historic transition of economic power toward Asia is underway, and where the point of no return on global warming and environmental catastrophe lies just ahead if we have not already passed it. Today, the prospect of denting the right wing's iron grip on the U.S. exists for the first time since 9/11. Tomorrow is May 1, which for the first time in decades will be marked in the U.S. by genuinely mass working class actions, an outpouring of immigrants and their supporters for fairness and legal status for all, the potential for a peace and justice bloc to take shape and gain a foothold in U.S. politics, and for radicals who contribute to that bloc's unity and forward motion to take steps toward cohering into a relevant left trend, can at least be glimpsed. The generation that once believed that revolution was in the air is blessed with another chance, a chance to partner with the generations now coming to the fore, to pass on what we have learned from our accomplishments and our failures, and to make a difference and keep at it until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Max Elbaum, April 30, 2006.